The Fiscal Responsibility Act is one of the areas that need these reforms because it is very strategic in the fight against corruption. The main strategic objectives of the Act is to provide for prudent management of the nation's resources, ensure long-term macroeconomic stability of the national economy, secure greater accountability and transparency in fiscal operations within the medium-term fiscal policy framework, the establishment of the Fiscal Responsibility Commission to ensure the promotion and enforcement of the nation's economic objectives and for related matters, to ensure prudence and transparency in the management of financial resources of the state, to channel expenditure of the state towards provision of public goods, infrastructure, social and economic services, to premise government spending on a credible expenditure management framework. Having operated the Act for a decade, a number of issues are pertinent in assessing the effectiveness of implementation of the provisions of the Act and the Fiscal Responsibility Commission as its enforcer. There are observed deficiencies that render implementation and enforcement of the provisions of the Act too administrative, especially without clear-cut punitive measures. This is further compounded by the disposition of successive governments and agencies towards the Fiscal Responsibility Commission in the discharge of its functions as spelled out in the FRA. Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, it is paramount to note that the FRA is not only harbinger on good fiscal governance, it is also a potent preventive mechanism against corrupt practices. The Act aptly emphasizes procedural framework as well as limit its fiscal management. The cardinal principle of this bill, Mr. President, is the repeal and reenactment of the Fiscal Responsibility Act 2007 to provide such reviews and amendments that will reform the Commission. A brief history of the FRC. The FRA, which was signed into law in 2007, created the Fiscal Responsibility Commission, FRC, and was inaugurated 11 years ago on 3rd December 2008. The powers and functions of the Commission are contained in Sections 2 and 3 of the present Act, which empowers the Commission to enforce the provisions of the Act. Over the years, the FRA, which is not only the forerunner of good fiscal governance but also a potent preventive mechanism against corrupt practices, has been statutorily limited and ignored by successive governments. Justification of the bill. There is the need to repeal and to reenact the existing because of the following. Functions and powers of FRC. The powers given to the Commission in Section 2, 3, and 7 of the present Act has a drawback in that the provisions lack direct prosecutorial power for the Commission. This has led to undesirable situations where agencies approach requests and directives on compliance with tardiness, knowing fully well that there will be no consequences. Insufficient funding of the Commission. Given the enormity of the functions of the Commission, there is need to adequately fund it and not dependent on budgetary allocation from a source that is at the apex of its monitoring activities. Medium Term Expenditure Framework, MTEF. The FRA provides extensive procedures on the introduction of MTEF in the budget process as part of public finance management reform. In order to make the MTEF more effective and serve its objective, there is the need to make public consultation mandatory and not discretionary by the Minister of Finance and Budget Planning, Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning. Additionally, there should be corporate debt limit clearly defined for the 3 tiers of government in the MTEF and the strategies for its reduction and sustainability alongside timelines for the preparation and approval of MTEF. Annual budget. This bill is necessary to ensure that this budget cycle remains January to December. Budget of government, corporations and agencies to improve compliance to fiscal transparency and accountability. Amendment has been made for all corporations and agencies to prepare and submit detailed revenue and expenditure estimates akin to MTEF and annual budget to the Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning. Remittance of operating surplus. Remittance of operational surplus of 80% by government corporations and agencies to the Consolidated Revenue Fund is reinforced in Section 22 of the existing Act. There is need for the remittance to be made not later than 30 days after the end of the statutory deadline for publishing of annual audited financial statement. Enforcement of penalties. All categories of infringements of the FRA should face sanctions, includes payment of fines, prison sentence or both, and other punitive measures as may be ordered by the court. Direct prosecutorial power and sanctions for infringement will change the implementation and compliance with the FRA to ensure fiscal transparency and accountability in the management of the nation's resources. Establishment of Fiscal Responsibility Council. This bill will deepen implementation of FRA across the Federation through the establishment of a Fiscal Responsibility Council. Mr. President, my distinguished colleagues, I urge you to support this bill and give expeditious passage to repeal and to re-enact the Fiscal Responsibility Act 2007 because it seeks to strengthen fiscal management across the Federation. At the same time, reposition the Fiscal Responsibility Commission to deliver its mandate. I so move. Thank you, Mr. President, my distinguished colleagues.
Thank you, Senator Ibugle.
Mr. President, if we are going to get it right as a country, this Fiscal Responsibility Act will help us to deepen what I call our accountability, reducing corruption, and putting all our MDAs on their toes. Mr. President, we just succeeded in passing our budget, returning the budget to the cycle of January to December. A lot of the assumptions, the inherent assumption that was in that budget, a lot of them would depend on this Fiscal Responsibility Act. Mr. President, anything that will bring us to speed as to what best practices should be supported, particularly when it comes to our finances. Mr. President, hitherto, when you look at this Fiscal Responsibility Bill, there are a lot of gaps there. Needless for me to repeat all that she has said. Those gaps, with this repeal and reenactment, all those gaps will be sorted out. People will now know that there are consequences for their actions. When you just sit in one office in none of these MDAs and just do things that you know that ultimately, even when you did not follow procedures, nothing will happen to you. People will now know that they are going to be put on the spot and they are going to be punished when they do not follow due process. Mr. President, it will not matter how big our revenue is if it is not well managed, if we do not make sure that all our expenses, all our expenditure follow due process, such that we'll reduce waste, we'll reduce corruption, transparency will be entrenched, and accountability will be entrenched when we follow all these procedures. If you look at our MTEF, all of the principal guidelines of MTEF has been covered by this Fiscal Responsibility Bill. So, Mr. President, I will want to say that all of us, all my colleagues, I will want to plead with you that this is one of those bills that can help us achieve all the desired results that we wanted in the budget that has been passed. It will do two things for us. It will help us to increase, when we follow this, to increase our revenue. And it will help us, most importantly, to make sure that we get value for whatever expenditure that is being made. So, Mr. President, I want to join my colleagues to say that this bill should be read for the second time and should be appropriately be sent to the committee that is in charge of ensuring that this bill is finally passed. So, Mr. President, I second this bill, and in seconding it, I've advanced some of the things that made me to second it. Thank you, Mr. President.
It's a very important bill because it is meant to cure all the deficiencies of the Fiscal Responsibility Act passed in 2007. Presently, as the Act is, the Commission lacks the capacity to enforce the Act. And what Senator Aisha did is to give the teeth to the Commission to enforce all the deficiencies, to enforce penalties where possible. Mr. President, it's a well-known fact that there is a lot of waste and corruption in the way budget is being prepared in this country. Deliberately, some MDAs don't even implement the budget. Even if the money is there, they don't care. They just leave it like that. We have seen it when we go for oversight. There is a lot of waste and mismanagement of our resources. And this act, if approved, will certainly cure the deficiencies. I urge all my colleagues to support this amendment, and it will certainly bring a lot of sanity into the financial management of our country. Secondly, Mr. President, in this act, whatever is budgeted, whatever is earned, whatever the country earned, must be budgeted. We have seen a situation where some ministries and agencies will budget something they don't even have. They start making assumptions on monies that are not there at all. So if we approve this, it will stop this kind of practice. So this is a very important amendment, and I urge all my colleagues to support it. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator.
Territorial districts in Nigeria. Mr. President, very distinguished colleague, let me join other colleagues in thanking and commending my dear sister, Senator Binani, for coming up with this all-important amendment to our Fiscal Responsibility Act. Mr. President, to start with, we've been talking about corruption. And we have said that corruption is not about the people we appoint to these offices that can stem the tides of corruption as far as this country is concerned, but for us to build the institution. And if there is any such institution that we must build, I think Fiscal Responsibility Act is one of them. Mr. President, this is one act that at a point when Nigeria wants to amend, we have to travel as far to Brazil to understudy how the Fiscal Responsibility Act is being put into use. It is after this study we came back and put together this act that we are sorting its amendment and full implementation by December 3rd, 2008. Between 2008 till date, the question we should ask ourselves, what is the effect of this act on our day-to-day transaction as a government? If this act has been properly put into use, I think by now and today, there will be less complaint about how government activities, payment and revenue are being judiciously applied. As we speak, the head of the Fiscal Responsibility Act has been in acting capacity for 5 years. Has been in acting capacity for 5 years. In terms of funding, I can conveniently tell us that the budget of Fiscal Responsibility Act, which will serve as a watchdog, is nothing to write home about. And for this bill, or for this act, to have a bite and a teeth, the financial independence of that commission must not be in doubt. There are a lot of functions, objectives contained in the present act, but as Senator Alero has said, they lack the capacity to even implement the act the way it is as at now. So the amendment we are sorting, which I am totally in agreement with, is to strengthen the Fiscal Responsibility Act Commission, to reposition the Fiscal Responsibility Act Commission, to truly make them independent of any harm of the executive. Because that is the only way that we can have a commission that is truly functional, that is truly committed to do everything to ensure we put an end to this issue of corruption, most especially as contained in the present act. 25% of the operational surplus must be remitted into the Consolidated Revenue Fund account. The question is, how many agencies of the government has complied with these directives? And in the failure that they don't work towards this act, who is the one looking? We have 640-something agencies of the federal government. This commission needs to go round to ensure, one, the compliance with this act, two, judicious implementation of our budget in terms of their capital expenditures. But even the funding to go round is not there. So, going forward, the amendment so proposed or be sought for is to, among other things, to reposition this particular commission. I am in total support. I am looking forward, at least, to have a Fiscal Responsibility Act Commission that is truly independent. I have had opportunity more than 3 times for this agency to appear before my Committee on Finance. But what we receive, information that we receive from them, is nothing to write home about. Even the report generated by this commission is not even implemented, not to talk less of consideration. So I agree, and I'm saying that this Senate should come out and make sure that we give this amendment a jet speed consideration, so that it will assist and it will be in line with the legislative agenda of the 9th Senate, which is to reposition, among other things, all our revenue generating agencies and to ensure full compliance with the relevant laws as passed by the National Assembly. Thank you, Mr. President. I so submit.
My sister, Senator Binani, for sponsoring these amendments. Mr. President, I had an encounter with the distinguished Senator Aishatu, and I can attest to the fact that she had actually consulted widely on the contents and the proposals on this toward this amendment. Mr. President, there is no gainsaying that as at the time this law was passed, about 10 years ago, it was the best thing to have happened at that time to the public procurement process and public finance management. Mr. President, the content of this act, as stated in the lead debate, was to adhere strictly, enhance transparency and accountability, ensure compliance to basic public procurement and financial regulations, and make public procurement even more transparent. Mr. President, a law that was passed 10 years ago and due for amendment 10 years thereafter, I believe it is the constitutional right of this Senate and National Assembly to make laws, review laws from time to time in line with the current realities. Mr. President, as my earlier leaders have spoken, Senator Olero and Solomon Olamileko, we believe that this amendment will further strengthen the areas of weaknesses in the implementations of this act. But most profoundly, Mr. President, let me state here categorically that it is the responsibility of this National Assembly to ensure that every single business unit of government adheres strictly to this act. And I must confess that the 9th Senate have actually written their names in gold. Mr. President, it is within the confines of this Senate, within 6, 7 to 8 months, that we have reviewed most of the weak laws. We came up with the PSC Amendment Act. We have done the Public Procurement Act. We have done the Finance Amendments, and now we are going to cap it now with the Public Procurement Amendment Act. I believe that we are doing everything humanly possible within the limits of our powers to make sure that we empower the executive to deliver dividends of democracy to our people. So I support this amendment in totality, and it's not about passing the law, Mr. President. It is better to implement a bad law than not to implement a law at all. So I believe that we must, the onus and the responsibility to ensure the effective implementation of our laws in this country is vested in this National Assembly. So I support this in totality, and I urge all my colleagues to support same. And I thank you, my dear sister, for doing a good job. Thank you, Mr. President, for this opportunity.
Thank you very much.
To have a merge between the Fiscal Responsibility Commission and the Revenue Mobilization and Fiscal Commission. Now, up till now, the MDAs are saying that, look, there is a policy to merge these two institutions, and therefore there is no need to do any work by the Fiscal Responsibility Commission. But I think this is the right time. Senator Aisha is bringing, the repeal and re-enactment, because there are so many areas of this bill or of the act that need to be amended. So many of them, and so many of them that are aligned with other commissions, and also some that are contradictory to others. So I think, I support this, the reading of the second reading of this bill, and I commend, Senator Aisha for doing a wonderful job. Just like Senator Akpan has said, she has consulted widely, and she has done a thorough job on this. I think was it in January or so, the Committee on Public Accounts had also have, a summit on this bill. So I think it's important that we look at it, and it's important that we work on the amendment of this bill. And I commend and also support the second reading of this bill. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This is a very, very critical second reading. We have a lot.
And to also say that this amendment is very timely, is very strategic, and it's also very tactical, because it will complement some of the very beautiful efforts we have put in amending some of these bills, like the finance bills and others. But I think the point I would like to highlight here is in making sure that the importance of this bill is realized. We should take note of the fact that the issue of operational surplus which was mentioned here, I think when we come to look at the clauses of this bill, it will be very important that we ensure there is some synergy with what the Constitution says. Because the Constitution is saying all revenues should go into the consolidated revenue. All revenues. And here we are saying people can operate, and then it is the operational surplus. So I think we must find a way of removing some of the contradiction between these two aspects. Either by way of amending the Constitution to reflect the realities that we are dealing with, or making sure that we go the whole hog to stick to what the Constitution says. Fortunately, the Constitutional Amendment Committee has just been mentioned, and so this work should take note of that. Then the other thing I want to add is, one of the objectives says ensure long-term macroeconomic stability. But if you look at how we operate the budgeting process, we are depending on the medium-term expenditure framework. So I think we need to ensure that we have a long-term plan, which is one of the things that is also missing. And it is from the long-term plan that we should be drawing the medium-term expenditure framework. So I think I want to draw our attention to this, because if there was a long-term plan about, for example, our railways, and some people have stuck to that long-term plan, I think we'll have made some meaningful progress. And I recall sometimes in 2007 or thereabout, I can't remember specific year, but I think around that area, when we had the infrastructure master plan, for example, the infrastructure master plan just came in and was sitting on nothing. There was no law linking it up. And so the Fiscal Responsibility Act, taking cognizance of the fact that we want prudent management of our nation's resources, must begin to speak to some of these intendment, so that overall we know there will be consistency from government to government, irrespective of political party. Because the problems Nigerians are facing is not defined by our party or any other divisions that we know. And so I want to say very clearly that the aspect of the annual budget, which we all come to do, what is the extent to which it is linked to our medium-term expenditure framework within what the ministries, departments, and agencies do? You will see that there is no link. And when this thing started in 2004, I was privileged, I was in Federal Ministry of Agri, and I remembered very well we spent 2 weeks in Transcorp Hilton on the medium-term expenditure framework. And the whole idea was you do it 3 years, and from which you'll be taking your 1 year budget. But I want to say, Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, nobody can give you for a fact that there is a medium-term expenditure framework for a particular ministry, and when you take it for 2020, by 2021, you are sure it is a continuation of that medium-term expenditure framework. What we have is just on paper. We try to address it on paper, but in reality, we are not. So I think this is an opportunity for us to correct some of these, errors that have been committed over the years, so that we can consistently see. For example, it's pitiable that a road project started 10 years ago. You see, because there is no consistency of even saying, oh, you want to do 2 kilometers this year, next year 2 kilometers, at least so that after 10 years, you can be sure you know the kilometers you are having. And this is the fault of not adhering to what the provisions of this act is. So I think if we do that, then we will have been doing justice. Then the return to January to December budgeting cycle will be more meaningful. And Nigerians will know that government is truly working for them. And I think this Senate has already taken a stand that it's a Senate that works for Nigeria. So I support this bill, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Senator Geshan-Bassey.
Thank you, Mr. President. Geshan-Bassey, Cross River South. Mr. President, let me know that perfection is probably unattainable, but we must keep striving towards perfection. And I think that what we have here is that after 10 years of using this document, we have found that there are flaws in this document that must be amended. And what our colleague has done is to identify those flaws and bring them to the attention of this chamber. I hope that all my colleagues will support this very important bill. I think everything has been said that needs to be said. The Fiscal Responsibility Act is an instrument, or a budgetary instrument, that is used as a tool for economic growth. If it is properly utilized, as it is utilized in other climes, it becomes one of the most important tools for economic growth. I also hope that there is a strong audit component in this bill. I've not read the current bill. It will probably be at the public hearing. But these kinds of instruments are the things that we use to ensure that our country progresses and moves forward in its fiscal planning. Therefore, I want to strongly support this bill. I want to strongly commend the mover of this bill and say that as we move forward, we should apply these types of reviews, periodic reviews, to all our laws as we move forward. Thank you, Mr. President.
Once again, let me just point out, it's very, very clear from the preponderance of the contributions that this bill is headed.
It goes for recurrence. But at the end of this year, believe me, Mr. President, we might not see in this country where 4 trillion naira is put in for the welfare of the people in terms of infrastructure. That goes a long way to tell you why this bill is act and amendment needed now, to be able to checkmate these very malpractices we find in most of our agencies. We have embarked so much on fighting corruption, and of recent, you see where we have been rated as a nation. Mr. President, our problem is that institutions are not working, and bills like this are not made effective. Rather than fighting corruption, let's learn to prevent corruption by establishing bills like this. It will go a long way. Because one of the problems in our country is that we fight corruption, and we're smart to change anything, whether it be at the public service, at governance level. That's the problem we've had. I might not have enough time, but Mr. President, sometimes it is good to ask those people who have been through some of this for their practical experience to help this nation in taking further decisions. It helps a lot. Because when we make budget, we should also bear in mind implementations and situations like this. Because they're not tied. We make budgets separate without looking at the acts. So sometimes the act fight the budget that we have, and we don't get a good result. So Senator Aisha, I commend her for this, and while we also begin to look inwards and see how we can begin issues of prevention rather than fighting or curing, that will help us a whole lot in achieving more for the ordinary people of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Gubil, and I'll put the question after Senator Gubil. Please.
Okay, thank you very much, Your Excellency, distinguished colleagues. Actually, we don't have to waste much time on this because the bill is so important that it should be read the second time. I remember about 4 weeks ago we had a seminar on budget and planning. And the argument was that there is more of budgeting rather than planning. How the money is going to be utilized, how there is going to be accountability, and so on and so forth. And I think it's very, very important that we pass this for the second reading. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'll put the question. Those in favor that this bill now be read the second time, say aye. Those against, say nay. The ayes have it. Clerk of the Senate.
Second reading.
A bill for an act to provide for prudent management of the nation's resources, ensure long-term macroeconomic stability of the national economy, secure greater accountability and transparency in fiscal operations within the medium-term fiscal policy framework, and the establishment of the Fiscal Responsibility Commission to ensure the promotion and enforcement of the nation's economic objectives, and for related matters 2020, second reading taken, and refer to the Committee of Finance and to report back within 4 weeks. Senate Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. My highly respected and distinguished colleagues, the third order of the day is the second reading of the University of Maritime Studies Oron Establishment Extracurricular Bill 2020. Distinguished senators will recall that the bill was read the first time in this chamber on Thursday, 12 December 2019. Mr. President, you may wish to invite Senator Akon Eyakin to move the motion for the bill to be read the second time.
Senator Eyakin Akon Etim.
Thank you, Mr. President. I seek for your permission to read the bill for an act